I'm Leonard, the Calhoun County Extension Director and the Horticulture Agent. Today we're going to be talking to you about one of my favorite topics, raised bed gardening. Non-traditional type of gardening that anybody can do regardless of how much space, money, or time you have. And today we're going to mention some of the most frequently asked questions of raised bed gardening. The first one is, what kind of material do I need to construct my raised bed out of, and how do I do it? You can see the 4 beds I have beside me are wooden beds, traditional raised beds. They're constructed from pressure-treated pine. Modern pressure treatment methods use copper as a fungicide to protect from wood rot. This is significantly different from back in the day when we would use arsenic or creosote or all kinds of other harmful materials to pressure treat. You might not want to garden in those, or you may have some apprehensions about using those kinds of chemicals. But modern pressure-treated lumber is extremely safe to use. That's a myth we have to bust on a fairly regular basis. I also tend to like the 4x8, 4 feet by 8 feet dimensions. That allows you to easily reach across into the middle of the raised beds, and it's not so big that you have to have a lot of soil to fill it up. And it's just an easy size to fill with plants and to grow in. I also prefer it to be 12 inches off the ground, so we're using pressure-treated 2x12 pine lumber here. That gives you 12 full inches of rooting space. If you go smaller, using 8-inch, 10-inch, or 6-inch lumber, you just don't have the rooting space for some crops like carrots, okra, tomatoes, other larger rooted, deeper rooted plants. So this is kind of the configuration I like to use. Pressure treated pine lumber, 12 inches off the ground, and 4 feet by 8 feet. One of the real advantages of raised bed gardening is that you can control the soil. Maybe you live in an area like me that's sandy in nature and is not the best for gardening in the ground. Maybe you live in an area where there are some fungal organisms, nematodes, or other diseases that tend to hang around in the soil. We can control the soil in the raised bed. And so one of the questions that we get is, what kind of soil do we want to use in our raised bed now that we've got it built? You don't want to go get it from your neighbor's yard or from your yard or from a borrow pit, you know, where you're just getting topsoil and putting in here. Again, the advantage of raised beds is that we control the soil. So we're looking for soil that's going to have excellent nutrient holding capacity, water holding capacity, excellent drainage, and good airspace in there so that our roots can breathe. And we can accomplish that really easily by a mix of half and half, 50% mushroom compost and 50% pine bark. Now, if you don't have access to bulk pine bark or mushroom compost, nearly any good commercial bagged product will do. Potting soil, raised bed soil, garden soil, things like that. So again, to recap, one of the real advantages that we have here is to create our own soil, and it should look more or less like this. A really common question I get is, should I start my plants via seed or transplants? And there's pros and cons to each. With seeds, you get a little bit more versatility. You have more varieties to choose from. You have more control when you plant them. You can order them year-round. You can start seeds indoors and then transplant outside when you get ready to get a kickstart on your garden. The downside to seeds is that there's a lot more that can go wrong. You've got to take the plant from that tiny seed through germination, growing the seedling, and then making fruit. With transplants, you've got about a 20-day head start on your seeds. You've got a growing, living plant, healthy plant that's already there. And so the degree of difficulty has just gone down. Now, it's not all roses with transplants. There are some downfalls. The first one is that you're at the mercy of nurseries when they want to stock them. So if you want to get a head start and get your garden planted early, that may not be the case if the plants aren't in stock when you want to plant them. You're also at the mercy of just the old standard varieties that are normally stocked on garden center shelves, like this Black Beauty eggplant. I planted these as transplants back in the summer, and I was at the mercy of just the old standard Black Beauty variety. If I wanted something a little bit more interesting, I would have needed to have ordered and planted my own seeds. Even though we're dealing with organic raised bed soils, we still have to add fertilizer. These soils, while they do contain a lot of organic matter, don't contain high amounts of the specific nutrients that plants need to grow and thrive. So we have to add fertilizer. When you go to a garden center, you may be overwhelmed by the amounts and types of fertilizers that are there. There's really only a couple of things you need to know. There's organic fertilizers, which just tend to break down a little bit slower and have lower concentrations of nutrients. There's inorganic fertilizers, which can be slow release or quick release and tend to have higher concentrations of nutrients. And then you may find liquid fertilizers and granular fertilizers. Again, that's just kind of personal preference, however you want to do it. What matters really are the three numbers on the front of the bag, the N, P, and the K, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. Now, for instance, in a 10-10 fertilizer, a 10-pound bag of 10-10, the 10 is a percentage, 10%. So in a 10-pound bag of 10-10, it has 1 pound of nitrogen, 1 pound of phosphorus, and 1 pound of potassium, the three main nutrients that plants need to grow and thrive. When fertilizing our raised bed garden, we really have two questions to ask: when and how much. For our when question, we want to make sure that we don't fertilize before we have plants that are actively growing. So for seedlings, we want the seed to be sprouted, germinated, have good plant growing above the ground, and good roots growing below the ground so that the plants can capture the fertilizer we put out. Same way with transplants. We want to give the plants about a week, 3 or 4 days to a week, to over transplant shock, put out new roots, begin growing again so that they can take up the fertilizer that we put out. After we do that, our initial application, once the plants are ready to get it, we'll wait about 30 days and make another application. So, for the next question of how much to put out, we're going to go for a general rule of thumb for 1/3 to 1/2 a pound of nitrogen per 100 square feet. Now, if we refer back to our earlier example of a 10-10 fertilizer, a 10-10-10, that equates out to about 3 to 5 pounds of 10-10 per 100 square feet. Now, this makes for pretty easy math, and we can go to our individual raised bed, which is 32 square feet, 4 feet by 8 feet equals 32 square feet, and that's about 1/3 of 100 square feet. So for our 3 to 5 pounds of 10-10 per 100 square feet, we simply divide that by 3 for our raised bed here, and we get 1 to 2 pounds of 10-10 per raised bed per season. Now we want to break that application up, like we mentioned earlier, into 2 applications. One, after the seedling is up and growing, we make our first application of 1/2 to 1 pound of 10-10-10 after that application. About 30 days later, we make our second application of 1/2 to 1 pound of 10-10, depending on the crop. A couple of questions that I get asked really often in raised bed gardening are, do I need to practice crop rotation? And how do I work cover crops into my raised bed gardens? For the first one, the answer is yes, you do need to rotate your crops even in a raised bed garden. So crop rotation helps us in a couple of ways. If you don't rotate your crops and you grow the same crop, say lettuce, year after year after year, we can get buildup of nematodes, fungal organisms, bacteria, and other soil-borne pests that can attack our crops. By rotating other plants in there, it helps break the cycle of these pests. I'll give you a quick example from my garden. Because I have 4 raised beds here, if I make this bed my leafy green and lettuce garden this year, next year I rotate it clockwise to the next bed, and so on and so forth, so that I get at least 3 years of a different crop before I plant it back in that lettuce and leafy green crop. That gives the bed plenty of time to quote-unquote rest and have time for the soil to recover and break the cycle of those pest organisms. Now for the cover crop question, you can absolutely integrate cover crops into a raised bed garden. I find the easiest way to do this is after a full season crop like tomatoes or broccoli in the cool season, tomatoes in the warm season, you have a lag period there before you plant your next season's crop. For the example of tomatoes, which is what I did in this bed, I grew tomatoes in the spring, planted in late March. The tomatoes grew wonderfully until they began to give out in the summer heat at the end of June, early July. Now I didn't have enough time, and the conditions were pretty harsh at that time of year to grow another crop before I planted my lettuce garden here. So what did I do? I planted a cover crop. The cover crop is going to allow you to capture the nutrients that were already in that soil and return them back for the next crop that you grow. And in the case of raised beds, which are made up of purely organic matter, they prevent your bed from sinking, the carbon actually oxidizing into the atmosphere. So they give you several benefits. And in particular in raised bed gardens, because we're only dealing with a month or two at the most that we need a cover crop, I like short-term cover crops like buckwheat that only take 4 to 6 to maybe 8 weeks to grow before you terminate them when they start flowering and setting seed. If you don't have enough space for a nice pretty wooden 4 foot by 8 foot, 32 square foot raised bed garden, you can even have a patio garden with simple black nursery containers or any other size decorative pot. I would recommend that you keep several of these on hand so that you can rotate your crops and so that you have enough to grow what you want. You just can't fit as much in a container as you can 4 foot by 8 foot raised bed garden. So in conclusion, if you have any questions about raised bed gardening or other horticultural topics, give your local IFAS Extension office a call.